We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Although the Declaration of Independence clearly states that all men are created equal, minority groups in the United States have been ostracized and denied basic civil rights for centuries. So we decided to go back in time to the heart of the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama, to hear the heartbreaking stories of struggle and violence, along with the inspiring tales of courageous heroes like Martin Luther King Jr., who embodied the African American spirit and determination. Focusing primarily on the business and media aspect of the movement, which began in 1955, we toured the Alabama state capitol, where, in the spring of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. led an estimated 25,000 people on a peaceful march and delivered one of his greatest speeches, demanding voting rights for African Americans. From there, we traveled down Dexter Avenue, lined with businesses where African Americans and whites once had separate but equal entrances, seating sections, bathrooms, and water fountains, as well as historical landmarks, including the church at which Martin Luther King Jr. preached for 6 years. King was a prominent Baptist minister and civil rights leader who led peaceful protests against racial discrimination. In the basement of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where he preached from 1954 to 1960, King and a collection of other civil rights activists planned and organized the Montgomery bus boycott. The church has served its community through the use of its facilities as a meeting place for many civic, educational, and religious groups. The concept of peaceful protests swept through the southern states as marches were organized by nonviolent activists to demonstrate the desire of African American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote and eliminate segregationist repression. The first march took place on March 7, 1965, from Selma to the Alabama state capitol. When the unarmed marchers reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers attacked them with billy clubs and tear gas in a turning point in the civil rights movement, which became known as Bloody Sunday. The media publicized graphic photographs and video footage of mortally wounded protesters. This type of media coverage influenced the civil rights movement by raising national awareness of the injustices of segregation and exposing the public to images of police dogs attacking young civil rights protesters, firefighters using high-pressure water hoses and fire hydrants to disperse protesters, and thousands of courageous activists who marched behind civil rights leaders.
Our guest today on Meet the Press is Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who led the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama.
Dr. King, former President Truman, was quoted by the AP as saying that the march from Selma, and this was his word, was silly and can't accomplish a darn thing except to attract attention. Would you say that what the march accomplished was worth that cost?
Well, first I would say that the march was not silly at all. I would think that the march did more to dramatize the indignities and the injustices that Negro people continue to face in the state of Alabama and many other sections of the South, more than anything else. I think it was the most powerful and dramatic civil rights protest that has ever taken place in the South, and I think it well justified the costs that we put in it.
Sit-ins throughout the South set the stage for the creation of a new organization that quickly gained momentum within the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These peaceful protesters were instructed to sit quietly and wait to be served. Students across the South continued to silently revolt in restaurants and diners where they would be denied service and experience verbal and physical abuse. Oftentimes, the innocent students were arrested for disorderly conduct rather than the white supremacists who attacked them. These audacious acts of rebellion captured the media's attention, striking a chord with other African American students who began to duplicate these sit-ins in other locations, compelling restaurants throughout the South to abandon their policies of segregation. On our journey through the heart of the civil rights movement, we discovered that many of the major media outlets and news companies were owned by upper-class white males, making it difficult for African American voices to be heard unless they resorted to major shows of strength and courageous rebellion. News companies used their resources to manipulate African Americans into keeping their place in society in an attempt to strike fear into the hearts of political dissenters. For example, any African American in the South who managed to register to vote had his name and address displayed in public newspapers, often leading to harassment, abuse, and, in extreme cases, lynching by radical groups such as the KKK. At the end of Dexter Avenue, Court Square Fountain was built in 1885 atop an artesian well and became the location where two communities merged to form Montgomery, Alabama. Eventually, it became the center of Southern slave trade, where thousands of enslaved African Americans were imported to the city by way of railroad and the Alabama River. They were taken off boats, chained together, and paraded up Commerce Street in a conjuncture comparable to that of the Trail of Tears. Now, it merely represents a treasured historical landmark. For African Americans in the mid-1900s, finding a good job was nearly impossible. The unemployment rate among African Americans in 1854 was 9.9%, nearly 5% higher than that of white Americans. Racial discrimination relegated them to dangerous, low-paying jobs where they were forced to complete the same mundane tasks every day for less than minimum wage. Most African Americans were maids, chauffeurs, servants, dishwashers, elevator operators, manual laborers, etc., making it impossible for them to raise their position in the social hierarchy. While they were given the lowest-paying, most hazardous jobs regardless of their age, experience, or skill, white folks enjoyed management positions, instilling and perpetuating in many of them a sense of superiority over colored people. We also revisited the roots of the civil rights movement. A Montgomery bus stop where Rosa Parks stood waiting to board a bus, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to galvanize a nation, to start a revolution on that cold December day. As we wandered through the Rosa Parks Museum, we learned that Parks was arrested for refusing to yield her bus seat to a white passenger, instigating the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for 382 days. The boycott ended on December 20th, 1956, when a federal court ruled for the Montgomery Improvement Association and declared segregated bus service to be unconstitutional. Of course, those who dared to question the injustices of racism did not go unpunished. For urging blacks to vote in August 1955, Lamar Smith, an elderly farmer and World War II veteran, was shot on the crowded courthouse lawn in Brookhaven, Mississippi. Although the sheriff saw a bloody white man leaving the scene, no witnesses came forward and the killer escaped with impunity. These incidences truly express the cruel truth of the incompetent, corrupt regime that thousands of African Americans fell victim to. Perhaps the most notable episode of violence came in Freedom Summer of 1964 when civil rights activists James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner left their base in Meridian, Mississippi to investigate the burning of Mount Zion United Methodist Church, which supported civil rights activity. The men were targeted by Neshoba County Deputy Cecil Price, a member of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. After leading the activists to an isolated spot, the Klansmen beat and shot them to death, drove their car into a swamp and set it on fire, and buried the men's bodies in shallow graves in an earthen dam. When the corpses were discovered, they were battered, bruised, and broken, just for being black, but as the autopsy photographs and x-rays had been destroyed, the injuries could not be confirmed. Overall, the trip was very educational, and it provided a new perspective of the civil rights movement. We felt the African American struggle. We saw their tears. We heard their hopeless, angry screams transform into determined shouts demanding an immediate change. We saw everyday citizens grow into brave civil rights leaders who spoke for those whose voices could not be heard. We discovered the amazing results of hopeful determination and the power of unification.